Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime Historian. Have you ever wondered how a single land, pressed between towering mountains and endless deserts, could be conquered time and again by Greeks, Arabs, Turks, Mongols, and yet never truly disappear? How its language, its stories, its sense of self could outlast every empire that tried to erase it? That question has puzzled historians for centuries. Tonight we trace the long, steady arc of Iran not as a series of dramatic battles alone, but as the quiet, persistent survival of one civilization inside many others. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening from somewhere far or near, drop a quick note in the comments, your city and the local time right now. It's always comforting to know who's sharing these quiet hours together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The land we call Iran is first of all a place of difficult geography. A high plateau, roughly 1 million square miles, lifted an average of 4,000 feet above sea level. To the west, the Zagros Mountains form a long barrier of folded limestone ranges. To the north, the Alborz chain rises sharply above the Caspian shore. To the east and centre stretch two great salt deserts, the Dasht-i Kavir and Dasht-i Lut, where summer temperatures regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius and almost no rain falls in a normal year. Yet wherever water finds a path through narrow river valleys, mountain springs, or the ancient underground channels later called Qanats, human settlement has clung stubbornly for thousands of years. Around 3000 BCE, in the southwestern lowlands near the modern province of Khuzestan, one of the region's earliest urban societies took shape. We know it as Elam. Its principal city, Susa, sat on the fertile plain between the Karun River and the first foothills of the Zagros. By this period, the Elamites had developed a pictographic script of their own, built large mud-brick temples called ziggurats, and organized a bureaucracy that recorded taxes, labor assignments, and offerings to their gods. Their art bronze statues of seated rulers, finely carved cylinder seals, glazed brick reliefs showing lions and winged bulls, shows contact with the older Sumerian cities to the west, and hints at trade reaching as far as the Indus Valley. Elam never became the kind of sprawling empire Mesopotamia sometimes produced. Its political life was more often a loose federation of city-states and highland valleys, frequently at war with neighbours or among themselves. Yet Susa endured. It would change hands many times over the next 3,000 years, but the city itself remained continuously inhabited, a fixed point on the map when greater powers rose and fell. From roughly 1500 BCE onward, a different movement began. Groups of Indo-Iranian-speaking peoples, pastoralists skilled with horses and chariots, drifted southward from the Central Asian steppes onto the Iranian plateau. They called themselves Aryans, a term that in their language simply meant noble or honourable. They brought with them a body of oral poetry and ritual that would later be written down as the Avesta, the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism. Their reverence for fire as a symbol of purity, their division of society into priests, warriors and herdsmen, and their use of a sky god named Ahura Mazda appear already in these early traditions. Over several centuries, two main branches settled and coalesced. In the cooler northwestern highlands around the modern cities of Hamadan and Kermanshah, the Medes formed tribal confederations. Farther south and east, in the region they named Parsa, later called Persis, by the Greeks, the Persians established themselves in a drier but strategically placed basin. For a long time, both groups remained on the margins of the great Near Eastern powers. The Assyrian Empire, at its height in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, regarded them chiefly as sources of horses, tribute, and occasional conscripts. Assyrian annals mention Median chieftains paying homage and Persian tribes sending archers, but neither people yet commanded serious attention. Around 700 BCE, the situation in the Zagros began to change. A Median leader named Deioces, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, gained a reputation as an impartial judge who could settle disputes that had long divided the clans. When the tribes grew accustomed to turning to him, he abruptly withdrew his services. Chaos returned. The clans, desperate for order, asked Deioces to become their king. He agreed on condition that they build him a proper capital. That capital was Ecbatana, constructed on a hillside with 7 concentric walls, each supposedly painted a different colour, the innermost gleaming with silver and gold plating. Whether the colours and precious metals were exactly as later writers described them matters less than what Ecbatana represented. A permanent centre that could draw scattered tribes into something resembling a state. Deioces ruled from this stronghold, reportedly keeping his people at a distance and allowing only trusted officials to approach, a pattern of royal seclusion that would appear again in later Iranian courts. His grandson Cyaxares turned the Median kingdom into a genuine military power. He reorganized the army into units separated by weapon-type spearmen, cavalry, archers, creating a more disciplined force than the older tribal levies. Around 614 BCE, he found his opportunity. The Assyrian Empire, exhausted by constant revolts and succession struggles, was visibly weakening. Cyaxares formed an alliance with Nabopolassar of Babylon, sealed by the marriage of a Median princess to the Babylonian prince Nebuchadnezzar. In 612 BCE, their combined armies besieged and destroyed Nineveh. The Assyrian capital was burned so thoroughly that it never recovered. With Assyria gone, the Medes claimed the northern and eastern portions of its former territory, stretching their influence from eastern Anatolia to the borders of Central Asia. Under Cyaxares' son Astyages, the Median realm reached its greatest extent. It appeared secure, wealthy, and unassailable. Yet in the southern province of Parsa, a young Persian prince named Cyrus was watching from inside the Median court. He had been raised partly under his grandfather Astyages' eye, learning the machinery of power at close range. In 559 BCE, he inherited the small Persian kingdom of Anshan, still nominally subject to Median overlordship. For several years he paid tribute and kept a low profile. Then, around 550 BCE, he moved. The revolt was remarkably swift and almost bloodless. Many Median commanders, resentful of Astyages, defected to Cyrus before the armies even met in earnest. Ecbatana opened its gates. Astyages was captured and, according to most accounts, treated with leniency. Cyrus did not destroy the Median state, he absorbed it. Median nobles kept their positions. Median customs continued in the court, and the administrative framework that had held the highlands together was kept intact. With the Median heartland now under his control, Cyrus turned west to Lydia, ruled by the famously wealthy Croesus. Croesus had consulted the oracle at Delphi and received the ambiguous prophecy that if he crossed the Halys River, he would destroy a great empire. He crossed. The empire destroyed turned out to be his own. In 547 BCE, Cyrus marched through winter, caught the Lydian army off guard near Sardis, and took the capital in a matter of weeks. Croesus became a captive, though later traditions say Cyrus spared his life and kept him as an advisor. 2 years later, in 539 BCE, Cyrus marched on Babylon, the city that Herodotus described as the greatest wonder of the world, its walls so thick that 2 4-horse chariots could pass on top, surrendered with almost no resistance. Babylonian priests and merchants, alienated by their own king Nabonidus, opened the gates. Cyrus entered as a liberator, taking part in the ritual hand-clasping of the god Marduk that confirmed legitimate rule. Shortly afterward he issued a famous decree, preserved on a clay cylinder now in the British Museum. The text announces that he restored temples, allowed deported peoples to return home, and ended the practice of forced resettlement. Among those permitted to go back were the Jews exiled by Nebuchadnezzar. The Hebrew Bible remembers Cyrus with unusual warmth, calling him a shepherd chosen by God. Whether this policy of tolerance sprang from personal conviction or from shrewd calculation is still debated. An empire that stretched from the Aegean coast to Central Asia could not be held by terror alone. Local legitimacy mattered. Cyrus offered it, and in return received compliance from dozens of different peoples. He died around 530 BCE while campaigning against nomadic tribes on the northeastern frontier. His body was carried back to Pasargadae, where a simple limestone tomb still stands. A traveller in antiquity reported an inscription above the door. "I am Cyrus, son of Cambyses, who founded the empire of the Persians and was king of Asia. Grudge me not this monument." His son Cambyses II inherited the throne and pushed the Persian frontier further still. In 525 BCE, he assembled a large force that crossed the Sinai Desert with the help of Arab guides who supplied water in leather bags. The decisive clash came at Pelusium, where the Persian army defeated the Egyptian forces of Pharaoh Psamtik III. Cambyses entered Memphis as victor and took the title of pharaoh, presenting himself in Egyptian temple reliefs wearing the traditional double crown. For 3 years he governed Egypt from the old capital, keeping many local officials in place while installing Persian overseers to collect tribute and secure the grain shipments that now fed the wider empire. A further attempt to push south into Nubia failed when supply lines stretched too thin across the desert, forcing a retreat. Greek writers later portrayed Cambyses as erratic and cruel in Egypt, but administrative records from the period show routine tax collection and temple maintenance continuing much as before. In the spring of 522 BCE, while returning from Egypt, Cambyses died under circumstances that remain unclear. Some accounts speak of an accidental sword wound while mounting a horse. Others mention illness or even foul play. What mattered immediately was the absence of an obvious successor. Cambyses had no living sons, and rumours quickly spread that he had secretly ordered the death of his younger brother Bardia years earlier to remove a rival. Into this vacuum stepped a figure who claimed to be that very brother. His name was Gaumata, a Magus priest who appeared in public declaring that he was Bardia and that Cambyses had lied about killing him. Whether Gaumata was an impostor or genuinely believed his own story has never been settled. What is certain is that many provinces accepted his rule, seeing it as a return to Achaemenid legitimacy. At this moment, a young Persian noble named Darius entered the story. He belonged to a collateral branch of the Achaemenid family and had served as a spear-bearer in Cambyses' personal guard. With 6 other noblemen he formed a small conspiracy. They rode to the palace at Ecbatana, found Gaumata in a private chamber, and killed him. The act was swift and decisive. Darius emerged as the new king, but he faced an immediate problem: how to persuade an empire, stretching from the Aegean to Central Asia, that his seizure of power was rightful. He chose a dramatic and permanent solution. High on a sheer cliff face beside the main road from Babylon to Ecbatana, at a place called Behistun, Darius ordered a massive inscription carved into the living rock more than 600 feet above the ground. The text, written in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, told his version of events in detail. A carved relief showed Darius standing with his foot on the chest of the fallen Gaumata, while 9 rebel leaders stood before him in chains. The gods, the inscription declared, had granted him victory because he spoke truth and the pretender had lied. Travellers on the road below could not miss the message, and no enemy could easily reach the carving to deface it. The same trilingual text would later become an unexpected gift to scholarship. When Henry Rawlinson copied it in the 1830s and 1840s, it provided the key that finally allowed scholars to decipher cuneiform scripts. Revolts broke out, almost at once, in several provinces. In Babylon, a man named Nidintu Bel claimed the throne. In Media, another leader named Phrevatish raised an army. In Egypt and the eastern satrapies, similar challenges appeared. Darius moved quickly, sending trusted generals with smaller, mobile forces rather than one huge army. Within 2 years, every uprising had been crushed. The speed and coordination of these operations showed that the administrative network built under Cyrus still functioned even during a succession crisis. Darius did not destroy the defeated rebels outright. Many local governors who had wavered were replaced with men personally loyal to him, but the underlying system of provinces remained intact. Once the immediate threats were over, Darius turned his attention to something no previous Persian ruler had attempted on this scale, giving the empire a clear internal structure. He divided the realm into roughly 20 administrative districts called satrapies. Each was placed under a satrap, usually a Persian or Median noble of proven loyalty, who collected taxes, maintained order, and reported directly to the king. To prevent any single satrap from becoming too powerful, Darius created separate chains of command. Military commanders in each province answered to the king alone, not to the satrap, and travelling inspectors, known as the kings, eyes and ears, arrived without warning to audit accounts and listen to complaints. This overlapping system of accountability became a hallmark of Achaemenid government for the next 2 centuries. Binding the provinces together was an engineering achievement that still impresses modern observers. Darius ordered the improvement and extension of a highway that became known as the Royal Road. It ran nearly 1,700 miles from the city of Sardis, near the Aegean coast, all the way to Susa in the Persian heartland. Way stations were placed at regular intervals where fresh horses and riders waited. Royal couriers could cover the entire distance in about 7 days, a speed that astonished Greek visitors. Herodotus later wrote that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness stopped these messengers, an observation that would one day appear on a New York post office. To make trade and taxation easier across such distances, Darius introduced a standard gold coin called the daric, stamped with an image of the king drawing a bow. He also fixed uniform weights and measures so that a merchant in Anatolia could do business with a merchant in Bactria, using the same units of value. These practical changes reduced friction and helped the empire feel more like a single economic space. Around 518 BCE, Darius began construction of a new ceremonial capital on a great elevated terrace in the Fars region, the traditional Persian homeland. The site was Persepolis. Thousands of workers, many of them paid wages recorded on clay tablets that still survive, raised columned halls and audience chambers decorated with reliefs, showing delegations from every corner of the empire bringing tribute. The carvings depicted Armenians leading horses, Indians carrying ivory, Ethiopians with giraffe skins, and Lydians offering gold. The message was visual and constant. All peoples of the empire were united under one king, yet each kept its own customs and dress. By the time these projects were underway, the empire had reached a size and level of organization that no earlier state had matched. Darius had taken the loose structure left by Cyrus and turned it into a functioning machine of governance. Yet even the best machinery cannot remove every tension. On the western edge of the realm, in the Greek-speaking cities of Ionia, resentment was quietly growing. The decisions made in those coastal cities during the next decade would pull the empire into a new and unexpected conflict that would test its resilience in ways Darius could not yet imagine. The simmering resentment in the Ionian cities finally boiled over in 499 BCE. These Greek-speaking communities along the western coast of Anatolia had lived under Persian oversight for decades. Local tyrants appointed by the satraps collected taxes and kept order, but many ordinary citizens felt the arrangement favoured Persian interests over their own traditions of self-rule. The spark came from Miletus, where a leader named Aristagoras saw an opportunity to break free. He appealed to the Greek mainland for help. Sparta refused, citing distance and risk, but Athens sent 20 ships, a small force, yet one that signalled solidarity among Greeks. The rebels struck inland and burned the satrapal capital at Sardis. When news reached Darius in Susa, he reacted with cold calculation. An attendant was instructed to remind him 3 times daily of the Athenians so the insult would not fade. The revolt itself was put down by 494 BCE. Miletus was sacked, its people scattered or enslaved. Darius now turned his attention westward with purpose. His first fleet, sent in 492 BCE, was wrecked by a storm off Mount Athos before it could reach Greece. 2 years later, a second expedition of roughly 25,000 men sailed under generals Datis and Artaphernes. They crossed the Aegean, burned Eretria on the island of Euboea, and landed on the plain of Marathon, 26 miles northeast of Athens. What happened there in 490 BCE became a turning point remembered for centuries. The Athenian hoplites, heavily armoured and fighting on familiar ground, charged the Persian line at a run. They folded the enemy flanks inward and drove the invaders back toward their ships. Persian losses ran into the thousands. Athenian casualties stayed under 200. A runner, according to later tradition, carried the news the full distance to Athens and collapsed dead upon arrival. The event gave its name to the modern marathon race. Darius died in 486 BCE before he could organise revenge. The task passed to his son Xerxes. Xerxes planned on a scale that dwarfed earlier efforts. He gathered perhaps 200,000 soldiers by cautious estimates and ordered a double bridge of boats across the Hellespont so the army could walk from Asia into Europe. The Greeks, divided among themselves, could muster only about 40,000 defenders in total. At the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, 300 Spartans under King Leonidas, together with several thousand allies, held the Persian advance for 3 full days. A local Greek showed the invaders a mountain path around the position. The Spartans fought where they stood until none remained. Xerxes marched on and burned the Acropolis in Athens, but the sea would decide the campaign. In the narrow strait of Salamis, the Greek admiral Themistocles lured the larger Persian fleet into waters too cramped for its numbers. The Greek ships, lighter and more manoeuvrable, crushed the Persian squadrons. Xerxes watched the disaster from a golden throne on the shore. The following year, at Plataea in 479 BCE, Greek land forces destroyed what remained of the Persian army on the mainland. Persia never launched another full-scale invasion of Greece. The long conflict wound down with the Peace of Callias around 449 BCE, which acknowledged practical boundaries neither side could cross. The wars left both civilizations altered. Greek cities emerged with new confidence that would fuel their classical age. Persia remained vast and wealthy, yet the experience planted a quiet question inside the empire. If the Greeks could resist, what else might prove difficult to hold? While Xerxes campaigned, the court at Persepolis had grown into a world of ceremony and intrigue. In 465 BCE, he was murdered in his bedchamber by Artabanus, the commander of the royal guard. Within months, Artabanus himself was killed by Artaxerxes I, Xerxes' son, who claimed the throne. Such palace violence would recur across the later decades of Achaemenid rule. Power in the royal court often flowed through women who managed alliances and influenced succession. Amestris, wife of Xerxes, and later Parysatis, mother of Artaxerxes II, appear in administrative records receiving rations, issuing orders, and holding estates. These were not ceremonial figures. They shaped decisions that affected satraps and generals. Meanwhile, the empire's provincial structure, once its strength, began showing strain. Satraps controlled large territories, private armies, and enormous revenues. When central authority softened, some governors tested independence. The great satraps' revolt of the 360s and 350s BCE saw coordinated uprisings across Asia Minor and Egypt. The empire wavered but held, partly because the rebels could never unite behind one alternative. Throughout these years, Zoroastrianism offered a steady spiritual framework. The faith of the prophet Zarathustra described a universe in cosmic struggle between Ahura Mazda, lord of truth and light, and Angra Mainyu, spirit of darkness and lies. Kings presented themselves as agents of order against chaos. Fire temples stood across the provinces, tended by priests known as magi. The religion had become so deeply woven into Persian life that it would survive political upheaval for centuries to come. One ruler briefly reversed the drift. Artaxerxes III took the throne in 358 BCE and acted with decisive ruthlessness. He reconquered Egypt in 343 BCE, suppressed the satrap revolts, and for a short time restored a sense of unity. Then, in 338 BCE, he was poisoned almost certainly by his vizier Bagoas. The throne passed through two more kings in quick succession. Into the resulting vacuum stepped a young Macedonian general who had studied under Aristotle and inherited the military genius of his father Philip II. At age 22, in 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont with roughly 40,000 men. The Persian defence collapsed with surprising speed. Two early victories in Asia Minor opened the western provinces. At Issus in 333 BCE, Alexander met Darius III in person and routed his army so thoroughly that the Persian king fled, leaving his family behind. Alexander treated the royal women with respect, a gesture that mixed honour with political calculation. The final blow came at Gaugamela in 331 BCE on the plains of northern Iraq. Darius had levelled the ground to favour his chariots, yet Alexander's cavalry charge tore the line open. Darius fled again. Babylon and Susa surrendered without resistance. Persepolis followed. The burning of the great ceremonial capital in 330 BCE remains debated. Some accounts say Alexander ordered it in revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century and a half earlier. Others describe a drunken banquet that spread out of control. Whatever the cause, the terraces, columns, and treasury were consumed. The Achaemenid Empire, built over 2 centuries by Cyrus and Darius, ended that afternoon. Even as he destroyed symbols of the old order, Alexander began to adopt elements of it. He wore Persian court dress, incorporated Iranian nobles into his administration, and demanded the proskynesis, the ritual of prostration, from his own officers. They resisted, viewing it as worship reserved for gods. In 327 BCE, he married Roxana, a Bactrian princess from what is now Afghanistan, and encouraged his commanders to take Persian wives. He aimed to fuse 2 civilizations into one rule. The project remained unfinished. In 323 BCE, Alexander died of fever in Babylon at 32. Within hours, his generals began arguing over the empire. The successors, known as the Diadochi, spent 40 years tearing the conquests apart. Iran eventually came under Seleucus, who founded a dynasty named after himself. Greek cities appeared across the plateau. Greek became the language of administration. Hellenistic culture pressed into Asian soil. Yet beneath the new marble columns and Greek inscriptions, older patterns endured. Persian dialects continued in villages. Zoroastrian fire temples kept burning. Local land arrangements and village hierarchies carried forward Achaemenid habits. Conquerors could change the names on coins and monuments, but they could not erase the deeper rhythms of the land. From the eastern edges of the former empire, a new Iranian force was already stirring, ready to step into the space the successors had left. Seleucus had been one of Alexander's most capable generals, a man who survived the chaos of the wars among the successors through patience and careful calculation. By 312 BCE he had secured Babylon as his base, and from there pushed eastward to reassert control over the Iranian plateau. His army combined Macedonian discipline with the administrative habits he had learned from the Achaemenid system he was inheriting. The Seleucid dynasty had arrived. What followed was an experiment unlike anything the plateau had seen before. The Seleucids did not simply occupy Iran. They tried to remake its surface while leaving deeper layers largely untouched. Greek colonists arrived in organized waves. New cities rose across ancient soil, bearing names that would have sounded foreign to earlier generations. Seleucia on the Tigris grew into one of the largest urban centers of the ancient world, its population eventually rivaling that of Alexandria. Along the trade routes of the plateau, dozens of smaller settlements carried Greek names, Greek grid plans, and Greek civic institutions. The gymnasium appeared in places where Zoroastrian priests had once performed their rites undisturbed. Administrative documents were now written in Greek. Coins bore Greek inscriptions and royal portraits. Correspondence flowed in a language most rural Iranians had never heard before Alexander's cavalry first appeared on their horizon. Yet the transformation was more apparent than real for the majority of the population. Beyond the city walls and the new marble colonnades, a different world continued with remarkable steadiness. In the agricultural villages that fed those gleaming centres, Iranian dialects remained the everyday speech. Zoroastrian fire temples kept their sacred flames tended by priests whose lineages and liturgical knowledge reached back through generations the Greeks had never touched. Local dynasts in more distant provinces, men whose families had served the Achaemenids in administrative roles, quietly continued governing their territories under a thin layer of Hellenistic loyalty. The deeper structures of Iranian society, its patterns of land, tenure, village hierarchies, and religious calendars, proved stubbornly resistant to reorganization by distant kings ruling from Antioch. The Seleucid Empire was simply too large to govern with real coherence. Stretching from the Aegean coast to the borders of India, it demanded constant military attention on multiple frontiers at once. The western provinces, with their lucrative trade routes and restless Greek populations, inevitably absorbed more royal energy than the eastern reaches of the plateau. By the middle of the 3rd century BCE, this imbalance was becoming visible. Royal governors in distant provinces began to accumulate local power and local loyalty, sometimes pursuing their own ambitions with only minimal interference from the centre. The mechanisms of control that had once held an empire together were loosening thread by thread. In a region the Greeks called Parthia, in the northeastern stretches of the plateau, a nomadic Iranian people known as the Parni were watching these developments closely. Around 247 BCE, their chieftain Arsaces led his warriors into the area and seized control from the Seleucid governor. The move was bold but timed perfectly. The Seleucids were entangled in dynastic struggles and pressure from Ptolemaic Egypt to the west. Arsaces consolidated his hold on Parthia, began striking coins in his own name, and established what would become one of antiquity's longest-lasting Iranian dynasties, the Arsacids. His successors treated his memory with such reverence that every later Parthian king adopted Arsaces as a royal title, blurring individual reigns into something approaching legend. For nearly a century after Arsaces, the Parthian kingdom remained a regional power, cautious and consolidating. Then, around 171 BCE, Mithridates I came to the throne. He possessed patience, paired with a clear vision of opportunity. He looked at the Seleucid realm, still vast on maps but hollow at its core, and understood that the moment for expansion had arrived. His campaigns moved westward and southward with steady pressure. Media fell first. Then the rich prize of Mesopotamia, with its ancient cities and accumulated wealth, came under Parthian control around 141 BCE. When Mithridates captured the Seleucid king Demetrius II in battle, the symbolic weight was unmistakable. A nomadic Iranian dynasty had humbled the heirs of Alexander the Great. The Arsacids governed their new territories with a flexibility that distinguished them from both the rigid Achaemenids and the more uniform Seleucids. Greek remained in use on coins and in some official contexts. Parthian nobles sometimes bore Greek names and collected Greek art with genuine interest. The famous Rhiton drinking vessels and bronze sculptures from this era show an aesthetic comfortable in two cultural worlds at once. Yet the underlying political structure was distinctly Iranian. The Arsacids ruled through a feudal arrangement of powerful noble houses, great clans such as the Suran and Karen who controlled vast estates and supplied the armoured cavalry that formed the backbone of Parthian military. Strength. These nobles owed loyalty to the king, but they were partners rather than subjects. They could mobilise thousands of horsemen for royal campaigns, and under different circumstances could fragment the kingdom from within. Architecture and daily life reflected this hybrid character. The city of Ctesiphon on the Tigris grew into an imperial capital of real grandeur. The distinctive Parthian Iwan, a vaulted hall open at one end, began appearing in palaces and public buildings, a form that would echo through later Iranian architecture for centuries. Trade flourished along the Silk Road routes that crossed the plateau. Silk, spices, and precious stones moved between China and the Mediterranean, passing through Parthian hands and bringing steady revenue to the treasury. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, the Parthian realm stretched from the Euphrates River to the eastern edges of Iran. A new rival had appeared on the western horizon. The Romans were expanding eastward, and the collision between these two powers would define the next several centuries of frontier history. Yet for the moment, the Arsacids had achieved something significant. They had taken the space the Seleucids could no longer hold and turned it into a stable Iranian-led state that blended old traditions with new realities. The plateau had once again absorbed its foreign rulers and begun shaping them in its own image. The Seleucid attempt to overlay Greek forms on Iranian soil had lasted roughly 2 centuries. It left behind cities, coins, and inscriptions that would survive for generations. More importantly, it demonstrated how lightly the deeper rhythms of Iranian life could be disturbed. Villages continued, fire temples burned, and local customs persisted. When the Parthians stepped forward to fill the gap, they did so not as outsiders but as Iranians reclaiming and adapting the inheritance of the land. The story of resilience that had begun with the Medes and Persians was quietly repeating itself under new names and new conditions. The Romans arrived in the east with the absolute confidence that had already carried their legions across the Mediterranean. In 53 BCE, Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome and a member of the ruling triumvirate alongside Caesar and Pompey, led 7 legions, roughly 40,000 soldiers across the Euphrates into Parthian territory. Crassus had purchased much of his political influence and now sought military glory to match that of his partners. He expected a quick campaign that would add another eastern province to Rome's growing list. Instead, he encountered Surenna, a commander from the powerful Suren noble house who bore his clan name rather than a personal one in most Roman records. Young, tactically brilliant, and audacious, Surenna understood precisely the strengths and limitations of Roman heavy infantry. Legions were nearly unbeatable in close formation on flat open ground when they could lock shields and advance as a single disciplined mass. They were far more vulnerable when facing mobile cavalry that refused direct engagement and instead harassed from a distance. The Syrian desert between the Euphrates and the town of Carrhae offered ideal conditions for what followed. Parthian horsemen did not charge in a single mass but arrived in swirling waves. Roman infantry formed the testudo, shields locked overhead and to the sides, waiting for the momentum to exhaust itself as it had against so many other enemies. But the Parthian horse archers simply kept circling, kept shooting, and crucially kept being resupplied. A long camel train moved steadily behind the Parthian lines, carrying thousands of arrows. The rain of missiles did not stop. When Roman soldiers broke formation to pursue, they met the famous Parthian shot, arrows released backward at full gallop with lethal accuracy. Crassus died in the aftermath, killed during what was supposed to be a negotiation. His severed head was reportedly delivered to the Parthian court during a performance of a Greek tragedy, an ironic detail preserved in later accounts. Around 20,000 Roman soldiers fell on the field. Another 10,000 marched into captivity and vanished into the Parthian east. Legends persisted for centuries that some of these lost legionaries eventually settled in Central Asia, their descendants later encountered by Chinese chroniclers near the borders of Han territory. The evidence remains debated, but the story itself reflects how deeply the disaster haunted Roman memory. The captured eagle standards became a sustained source of humiliation. For decades, those legionary eagles stood in Parthian temples as trophies, until Augustus recovered them through diplomacy in 20 BCE, an event he celebrated with such public ceremony that one might almost forget no battle had been fought to reclaim them. Mark Antony tried where Crassus had failed. In 36 BCE he launched a Parthian campaign that collapsed under poor planning and constant harassment by Parthian mounted archers. He retreated, having lost roughly a quarter of his force, though he survived to face other defeats later. The wars that followed across the next 2 centuries settled into a grinding rhythm of raid, counter-raid, and negotiation along the Euphrates frontier. Armenia served as a perpetual buffer state, whose throne both empires repeatedly disputed and occasionally seized. Neither power could deliver a decisive blow. Roman legions dominated siege warfare and pitched battle on favourable ground. Parthian feudal cavalry could evade, exhaust, and punish, but lacked the numbers and organisation to hold large territories permanently against determined Roman occupation. The Emperor Trajan came closest to a decisive Roman victory. In 116 CE, he sacked the Parthian capital at Ctesiphon and briefly reached the Persian Gulf. Standing on its shore, he reportedly lamented that he was too old to follow Alexander further east. Rome created new provinces from the conquest, but Trajan's successor Hadrian abandoned most of them within a few years. The Euphrates once again reasserted itself as the practical boundary between the two worlds. 2 empires, centuries of intermittent war, and the frontier barely moved. The exhaustion on both sides was real and cumulative. Something would eventually have to give. The breaking point, however, would not come from Roman pressure, but from internal dynamics within Iran itself. In the spring of 224 CE, on a plain near the Hormuz River in southwestern Persia, Ardashir, son of Papak and grandson of a Zoroastrian priest named Sasan, met the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV. In open battle, Ardashir had spent years quietly consolidating power in the ancient heartland of Fars, the same region where Cyrus and Darius had once ruled. The loose feudal confederation of the Parthians had always allowed ambitious provincial rulers considerable room to manoeuvre. Ardashir manoeuvred more effectively than anyone before him. Artabanus understood the threat too late. At the Battle of Hormozgan his forces were defeated, and he died on the field. With him ended the Arsacid dynasty after nearly 5 centuries of rule. A new name entered history, the Sasanians. What Ardashir built was deliberately different from the Parthian world that preceded it. Where the Arsacids had governed through decentralized alliances with powerful noble houses, the Sasanians deliberately reached back to the memory of the Achaemenids and restored the idea of a single, divinely sanctioned Persian king. The title they chose was Shahanshah, King of Kings, but now infused with explicit sacred meaning. The king was not merely a ruler, he was the earthly representative of divine order itself. Religion became the structural backbone of this new state. Zoroastrianism, which had persisted through Macedonian and Parthian rule without formal state patronage, was now elevated into an institutional framework. A priestly class called the Magi was organized into a proper hierarchy under a chief priest who stood as partner to the monarchy. Sacred fires burned in temples maintained by state authority across the empire. Orthodoxy was defined, texts were compiled, and for the first time Zoroastrianism possessed both institutional structure and royal backing on a scale that matched its theological claims. Ardashir's son Shapur I inherited the throne and immediately turned his ambitions westward toward Rome. 3 separate Roman emperors would fall before him in one way or another. The third encounter produced a moment unique in ancient history. In 260 CE, at the Battle of Edessa, the Roman Emperor Valerian personally engaged Shapur's forces. The battle became a rout, then a humiliation without parallel. A reigning Roman emperor captured alive on the battlefield. Shapur commemorated the victory with characteristic Persian scale. At Nakshi Rostam, the ancient cliff face near Persepolis where Achaemenid kings lay buried, his stonemasons carved an enormous rock relief. Shapur appears on horseback, massive and triumphant. At his feet kneels one Roman emperor begging for mercy. Behind him another stands in submission, grasping the royal bridle. The image broadcast across centuries what words alone could not sustain. Persia had humbled the greatest power of the Western world. These rock reliefs were not mere decoration. They were permanent political proclamations, speaking to every traveller who passed and to every future generation. Not everyone within the empire shared the official Zoroastrian framework. The 3rd century also produced one of antiquity's most remarkable religious figures, Mani, a prophet who wove together elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism into a new faith called Manichaeism. It spread with extraordinary speed across the empire and beyond, troubling both Zoroastrian priests and later Roman authorities. The Sasanian court tolerated it uneasily for a time, before eventually suppressing it. Military ambition, centralized royal authority, and religious vitality defined the early Sasanian period. Holding such a vast empire together across mountains, deserts, and contested frontiers would demand constant vigilance. By the 4th century, the foundations were firmly laid. What followed was something rarer in the ancient world, an empire that did not merely endure, but genuinely flourished, under rulers who understood both administration and culture. The reign of Khosrow I, who ruled from 531 to 579 CE and earned the title Anushirvan of the Immortal Soul, stands as the clearest expression of what Sasanian civilization could achieve when military strength, administrative skill, and intellectual ambition aligned. He inherited an empire shaken by internal revolt and foreign pressure. His father had been overthrown and murdered. The treasury was depleted. Powerful noble houses had grown accustomed to acting with near independence. Khosrow moved immediately to restore central authority. His administrative reforms were sweeping and systematic. He divided the empire into 4 great quadrants, each placed under a senior military commander who answered directly to the king. A new land survey standardized taxation across provinces. Instead of arbitrary assessments that varied year to year and often invited corruption, fixed rates were set based on soil quality, crop type, and expected yield. Peasants and landowners now knew precisely what they owed. Predictability replaced caprice, and in an empire that spanned from the Byzantine frontier to Central Asia, that predictability itself was revolutionary. Khosrow also reorganized Sasanian society into a rigid hierarchy of 4 clearly defined classes: priests, warriors, scribes, and commoners. Each class had specified roles, privileges, and obligations. The system was inflexible and often harsh, yet it provided a coherent social grammar that helped hold the diverse empire together for generations. Nobles retained their estates and influence, but their power was now more carefully channeled through royal service. Yet Khosrow's most enduring legacy may lie in the realm of learning rather than taxation or social order. In the southwestern province of Khuzestan, the Academy of Gondishapur became, under his active patronage, the most important centre of scholarship in the late antique world. When the Byzantine Emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools of Athens in 529 CE, many displaced Greek scholars travelled east. Khosrow welcomed them. The academy gathered Greek physicians, Indian mathematicians, Syriac translators, and Persian astronomers under one roof, creating a synthesis of knowledge without parallel at the time. Medical texts translated from Greek and Sanskrit were studied and expanded. Techniques developed there: surgical procedures, pharmacology, hospital organization would not reach Western Europe for centuries. The institution became a model for the great translation movements that would later flourish under the early Islamic caliphates. Administrative tablets and later Arabic sources confirm that Gondishapur remained active long after Khosrow's death, training generations of physicians who served courts from Baghdad to Cordoba. Sasanian material culture reached new heights during this period. Persian craftsmen produced textiles of extraordinary complexity. Woven silks depicting royal hunts, mythological scenes, and geometric patterns so refined that they were traded from China to Constantinople. Silver plates and bowls showed kings at the chase or enthroned, their surfaces chased and gilded with a technical mastery that set aesthetic standards imitated across the known world. When Islamic artisans of the 7th and 8th centuries searched for visual models, they instinctively turned to Sasanian forms, iwans, stucco decoration, animal motifs, and the royal iconography of enthroned rulers. Two cultural gifts from the Sasanian court travelled especially far. The game of chess arrived from India and was transformed at the Persian court into the strategic form recognisable today, with pieces reflecting the fourfold division of society: king, vizier, elephants, cavalry, infantry, and chariots. Polo, already a Persian passion, was played with a ferocity that blurred the line between sport and military training. It too spread westward along trade routes, carrying Persian cultural prestige with it. None of this cultural flowering existed apart from conflict. Khosrow fought the Byzantines with the same energy he devoted to domestic reform. The wars over Mesopotamia, Syria, and the rich trade corridors of the Near East were relentless. They drained treasuries and manpower on both sides across generations. His successors pressed these campaigns even harder. Under Khosrow II, Sasanian armies achieved conquests that seemed to vindicate every claim of Persian greatness. Jerusalem fell, Egypt was taken, Byzantine forces were pushed back toward Constantinople itself. For one extraordinary decade, it appeared that Persia had finally won the ancient contest with the West. The overreach proved catastrophic. Byzantine counterattacks, led by Emperor Heraclius, recovered lost territories and left both empires exhausted beyond recovery. Neither side recognized the true danger gathering in the Arabian Peninsula, a region neither Rome nor Persia had ever considered worth serious attention. The armies forming there would not merely defeat the Sasanians, they would transform Iran so completely that every dynasty examined so far would be reframed through an entirely new lens. The signs of collapse came suddenly. Two empires that had spent 4 decades bleeding each other. White finally negotiated a weary peace in 628 CE. The Sasanian state that emerged from that peace was barely recognizable. In the 4 years following the fall of Khosrow II, no fewer than 8 rulers claimed the throne in rapid succession. Generals murdered kings. Court factions poisoned pretenders. The treasury stood empty, the army fragmented, and the bureaucratic machinery Khosrow I had built with such care ground toward paralysis. Into this vacuum came something the ancient world had never encountered before. The Arab tribes of the Arabian Peninsula had always been, to Persian eyes, a peripheral nuisance raiding the frontier and retreating into their deserts. Between 632 and 636 CE, those tribes had been bound together by a new faith, Islam, revealed through the Prophet Muhammad and carried forward by his successors, the caliphs. That shared belief gave the Arab armies a unity and purpose no military reorganization alone could have created. The decisive confrontation came in the autumn of 636 CE at a place along the Euphrates called Al-Qadisiyah. For 3 or 4 days, the Sasanian forces under General Rostam Farrokad held against the Arab advance. Persian war elephants initially terrified the Arab horses. Sasanian infantry fought with the disciplined ferocity of soldiers from a proud tradition. But on the final day, a sandstorm blew across the battlefield, blinding the Persian lines. Rostam was killed. His forces broke. The road to Ctesiphon lay open. When Arab armies entered the Sasanian capital weeks later, the riches they found astonished even them. The treasury contained silks, jewels, and gold plate accumulated over centuries. The great throne hall, the Tak Kasra, with its soaring arched vault nearly 40 metres high, stood as a monument to everything Persia had built. It remains in partial ruin today, on the outskirts of modern Baghdad, the only surviving fragment of ancient Ctesiphon. Persia was not finished in a single battle. The young Sasanian king Yazdegerd III retreated eastward, rallying what forces he could and calling on local governors to hold the line. For 6 more years he moved from province to province, a king without a capital trying to reconstitute an empire that was dissolving around him. The final military reckoning came at Nahavand, deep in the Iranian plateau, in 642 CE. The Sasanian forces gathered there represented the last serious concentration of imperial power. The Arabs called their victory at Nahavand the victory of victories. After Nahavand, organised Sasanian resistance effectively ceased. Yazdegerd III spent his remaining years as a fugitive in his own empire, drifting eastward toward the borders of Central Asia, always seeking shelter, always one step ahead of both the Arab advance and the treachery of Persian lords calculating their own survival. In 651 CE, near the city of Mar, he was murdered not by an Arab soldier, but by a local miller for the few possessions he still carried. The last ruler of the Sasanian line died in obscurity, abandoned by the empire into which he had been born. 4 centuries of Persian kingship ended not with a final battle, but with a body by a riverbank in the eastern dust. What followed was not merely a change of rulers. It was a transformation so total that the way Iranians understood themselves, their language, their faith, their relationship to power would never be the same again. The Arab armies that swept across the Iranian plateau in the 630s and 640s brought not just a new political order, but a new faith. Islam, revealed through the Prophet Muhammad and carried forward by his successors, the caliphs, gave these desert warriors a cohesion and motivation that no previous invading force had matched. The early Umayyad Caliphate, established in Damascus in 661 CE, administered its vast territories through a system that drew a clear line between Arab Muslims and everyone else. Non-Muslims, including the millions of Zoroastrians still living across Iran, were allowed to keep their religion in exchange for a poll tax called the jizya. The arrangement carried an unspoken message. Conversion brought not only spiritual belonging but also relief from that tax and access to the privileges of the ruling class. Yet the Umayyad approach contained a built-in contradiction. Arab identity and Islamic identity were increasingly treated as the same thing. Iranian converts to Islam, known as mawali or clients, found themselves Muslim in faith but still subordinate in status. They were excluded from the highest administrative posts, paid less than Arab soldiers for the same service, and constantly reminded that the empire they now served viewed them as second-class believers. The resentment this system generated was not a quiet complaint. It became fuel. Through all of this pressure, Persian identity did not dissolve. It withdrew into quieter spaces and endured. The Persian language, now called Dari in its evolving form, continued to be spoken in homes, markets, and the courts of local administrators who had submitted to the caliphate without fully surrendering their cultural habits. The ancient spring festival of Nowruz, rooted in the Zoroastrian calendar, went on being celebrated with fires, feasts, and family gatherings across the Iranian countryside, a seasonal rhythm no foreign conquest had yet managed to interrupt. Zoroastrian priests preserved sacred texts in hidden libraries. Persian poets kept their language alive in oral forms that would later blossom into written masterpieces. By the early 700s, the tensions within the Umayyad Caliphate had reached a breaking point. A revolutionary movement began to take shape in the eastern provinces, particularly in Khorasan, the great Iranian region stretching across what is today northeastern Iran and into Central Asia. It drew together Arab settlers who felt the Umayyads had betrayed the egalitarian promise of early Islam, Iranian Mawali converts who had long nursed grievances, and communities that had never fully accepted Umayyad legitimacy. The movement organised under the black banners of the Abbasid family, descendants of the Prophet's uncle, and carried a message of Islamic equality that resonated deeply because so many people had been denied it. The Abbasid Revolution of 750 CE was, in the most direct sense, an Iranian revolution wearing Islamic clothing. The general who led the decisive military campaign was Abu Muslim, almost certainly of Iranian origin, commanding armies drawn heavily from Khorasan's Iranian Muslim population. When the last Umayyad Caliph Marwan II was defeated and killed, the world's most powerful empire changed hands, and Iranians had played the central role in making it happen. The Abbasids moved their capital eastward to the newly founded city of Baghdad, built deep within the cultural orbit of ancient Mesopotamia and Persia. Iranian administrators, scholars and courtiers poured into the new capital. The Persian bureaucratic tradition, the very tradition that had run empires for centuries, began reasserting itself at the heart of Islamic civilization. Persia had been conquered. It had converted. And now, quietly and with extraordinary patience, it had begun to reconquer from within. The reconquest did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It unfolded over generations in the courts of regional governors who gradually remembered what their ancestors had built. By the late 800s, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was growing hollow at its core. Real power had drifted to Turkish military commanders and ambitious provincial dynasties on the periphery. In Khorasan and Transoxiana, the land stretching from northeastern Iran into Central Asia, a Persian family called the Samanids had risen to govern in the caliph's name. In practice, they governed for themselves, and they did so in a language their Arab overlords barely recognized. The Samanid court at Bukhara became something remarkable, a laboratory for the rebirth of Persian as a literary language. For nearly 2 centuries, Arabic had dominated the written world of Islam, the language of the Quran, of law, of science. Persian had survived in spoken form but had retreated from the page. The Samanids changed that. They patronized poets who wrote in a refined new Persian, the same language their subjects actually spoke, and they filled their treasury with enough silver from Khorasan's mines to make literary patronage lavish rather than occasional. From this court emerged a figure whose work would define Iranian identity for 1,000 years. Abu al-Qasim Ferdowsi, born around 930 CE in the Tus region of Khorasan, spent the better part of 30 years composing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings. 60,000 verses told the mythic history of Iran from the dawn of creation to the Arab conquest, a vast tapestry of heroes, monsters, doomed kings, tragic loves, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos. When the Samanid dynasty fell to Turkish invaders before Ferdowsi could secure the promised reward for his work, he reportedly revised the poem's dedication in bitterness. No matter. The Shahnameh survived every dynasty that followed, preserving the memory of Rustam and Sohrab, Zal and the Simorg, in a Persian so pure that schoolchildren can still read it today. While Ferdowsi was writing mythology, his contemporaries were transforming the actual structure of human knowledge. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, born in 980 CE near Bukhara, had memorized the Quran by age 10 and mastered Greek philosophy and medicine not long after. His canon of medicine remained a standard medical textbook in European universities until the 1600s. His philosophical works pushed Aristotelian logic into new territory that would unsettle thinkers from Paris to Baghdad for centuries. Alongside him worked al-Biruni, perhaps the most quietly astonishing scholar of the medieval world. Born in 973 CE in what is today Uzbekistan, al-Biruni calculated the circumference of the earth with startling accuracy, wrote pioneering studies of Indian civilization, and produced work on mathematics, astronomy, and ethnography that feels almost modern in its empirical discipline. To the west, another Persian dynasty was making a different kind of statement. The Buyids, a Shia Muslim family from the Caspian highlands, marched into Baghdad in 945 CE and placed the Sunni Caliph under their protection. It was a polite arrangement that left the Caliph as a ceremonial figurehead, while the Buyids held actual power. For the first time since the 7th century, Shia Muslims governed at the center of the Islamic world. Persian administrative culture, Persian ceremonial titles, and Persian aesthetic sensibility flooded back into the heart of the caliphate. Persian had become something extraordinary, not merely the language of one people, but the shared literary and cultural tongue of an entire civilization, stretching from Istanbul to Delhi. Yet the forces gathering on the steppes cared nothing for poetry or philosophy. The Turkish world was moving, and Iran stood directly in its path. They came from the steppes of Central Asia, Turkish warriors riding hard and fast across the grasslands, carrying little regard for the civilizations that had preceded them. And yet something remarkable happened when they reached Iran. The land did not fall silent. It converted its conquerors. Mahmud of Ghazni, Sultan from 998 to 1030 CE, built the first great Turkish empire, centered on the Afghan city of Ghazni. He raided northern India 17 times, stripping temples of their treasures and earning a fearsome reputation across the subcontinent. Yet back at his court he kept Persian poets and scholars in extraordinary comfort. He famously promised Ferdowsi a gold coin for every verse of the Shahnameh, though that full payment, as history records, never arrived. The contradiction defined the Ghaznavids entirely. Conquerors who desperately wanted to be remembered as cultivated Persian kings. That contradiction was settled permanently at the Battle of Dandanakan in 1040 CE. A Turkish confederation known as the Seljuks met the Ghaznavid army in the deserts of Khorasan and destroyed it utterly. Within a decade, the Seljuks controlled Persia, Iraq, and Anatolia, eventually becoming the dominant power in the entire Islamic world. What did these new masters do with their conquest? They hired Persian administrators and let them run everything. The greatest of these was Nizam al-Mulk, a Persian bureaucrat from Khorasan who served as vizier to two successive Seljuk sultans for over 30 years. His treatise on governance, the Siyasatnama, written in elegant Persian prose, codified an entire model of statecraft, how kings should hear complaints, how spies should operate, how courts should function. It was essentially a Persian instruction manual handed to a Turkish dynasty, and they followed it faithfully. Nizam al-Mulk also established the Nizamiya Madrasa system, universities stretching from Baghdad to Nishapur that shaped Islamic scholarship for generations, while administrators governed, poets soared. Omar Khayyam, mathematician and astronomer from Nishapur, calculated the solar year with greater precision than the Julian calendar and simultaneously wrote the Rubaiyat quatrains of wine, roses, and philosophical resignation that would eventually reach Victorian England and astonish an entirely different civilization. Sufi mystical poetry deepened alongside him. Spiritual writers reached toward divine union through verse that blurred the line between sacred and intoxicating beauty. But empires built fast can fracture faster. After the great Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah died in 1092 CE, his sons fought each other across a generation of civil wars. The empire split into competing branches, and from the eastern margins rose a new power. The Khwarezmian Empire centered on the region south of the Aral Sea, ambitious and hungry. Persian culture had survived 2 Turkish conquests by absorbing its conquerors from within. Whether it could survive what was coming next from the east was an entirely different question. What came next from the east was not conquest in any familiar sense. It was erasure. In 1218 CE, the Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II made a decision that would doom his empire and devastate an entire civilization. When a Mongol trade caravan arrived at the border city of Otrar, the local governor suspecting espionage had its merchants executed. Genghis Khan sent ambassadors demanding justice. Muhammad had them killed too. It was, historians agree, one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in recorded history. The Mongol response arrived in 1219 CE, with a force estimated between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors, organised with a military precision no army of that era could match. Muhammad's empire, vast but hollow, crumbled within months. And then the killing began in earnest. Merv, the ancient Silk Road city in present-day Turkmenistan, once home to over 500,000 souls, fell in 1221 CE. Contemporary accounts, admittedly prone to exaggeration, describe Mongol soldiers dividing the survivors among themselves for systematic slaughter over days. The Persian historian Juvayni, who lived through this era, wrote that he wished he had not been born to witness it. Modern estimates suggest Merv lost the vast majority of its population. Nishapur followed. The city where Omar Khayyam had once calculated the movements of stars was razed so completely that Mongol forces reportedly stacked human skulls in pyramids separated by gender. Herat surrendered, then revolted, then was destroyed a second time with even greater ferocity. City after city across Khorasan, the cultural heartland of Persian civilization, ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. But the destruction went deeper than bodies and buildings. Iran's agricultural civilization rested on an extraordinary network of underground irrigation channels called qanats, some of them centuries old. Engineering marvels that carried water from mountain aquifers across desert plains. Mongol armies either deliberately or through sheer indifference destroyed these systems wholesale. Fields that had fed millions returned to desert. The ecological damage outlasted the violence by generations. The demographic numbers are staggering and contested. Scholars estimate that Iran's population may have fallen from somewhere between 10 and 15 million before the invasions to perhaps one-third of that figure within decades. Entire regions that had been densely settled and agriculturally productive remained sparsely inhabited for 2 centuries afterward. This was not merely a political catastrophe, it was a civilizational wound of extraordinary depth. And yet, with grim irony, the Mongols did what conquerors before them had always done in Iran. They stayed, and Iran worked on them. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, established the Mongol Ilkhanate across Persia following his westward campaigns in the 1250s CE. His conquest of Baghdad in 1258 CE destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate entirely, an event that sent shockwaves across the Islamic world. But Hulagu's wife was a Christian, his court was cosmopolitan, and Persian administrators once again found their way into positions of genuine influence. By the time of Hulagu's successors, Mongol Ilkhans were converting to Islam and patronizing Persian art, poetry, and architecture with considerable enthusiasm. Recovery was slow, painful, and uneven, but the Persian capacity to outlast catastrophe, to absorb even the most destructive of conquerors and reshape them from within, had not been extinguished. It had merely been tested at a scale no previous century had imagined. A new synthesis was emerging from the ruins, and with it, one of the most brilliant cultural flowerings in Iranian history was quietly taking shape. The transformation that previous chapter promised came most dramatically through a single ruler. In 1295 CE, Ghazan Khan ascended to the Ilkhanid throne and made a declaration that permanently altered Persia's political landscape. He converted to Islam not as a diplomatic gesture, but as a genuine reorientation of his entire administration. Persian became the language of governance. Mongol tribal customs gave way to Islamic law. Taxes were rationalized, irrigation networks slowly repaired, and the agricultural heartland of Khorasan began tentatively to breathe again. Ghazan's most enduring legacy arrived through his extraordinary vizier, Rashid al-Din. A physician-turned-statesman-turned-historian, Rashid al-Din assembled teams of scholars from across the known world to produce the Compendium of Chronicles, the first truly universal history ever written, spanning civilizations from China to Western Europe. It was an achievement of staggering ambition, and it was written in Persian. The language of Ferdowsi had become once again the language of world historical thought. Then Timur arrived. Born near Samarkand in 1336 CE, Timur the Lame, called Tamerlane by the Europeans who feared him from a distance, was a Turkish-Mongol warlord of ferocious military genius and equally ferocious cruelty. His campaigns into Iran beginning in the 1380s CE were not conquest in any administrative sense. They were punishment applied at industrial scale. Isfahan surrendered in 1387 CE, then rose in revolt. Timur's response was to order the construction of towers built from the skulls of its citizens, with estimates ranging from 70,000 to 200,000 dead. Baghdad, Shiraz, and dozens of lesser cities endured similar fates. What Ghazan Khan's reforms had patiently rebuilt across a century, Timur unmade in seasons. And yet, with the dark rhythm that defines so much of Iranian history, catastrophe again preceded flowering. Timur himself loved art and dragged craftsmen and architects back to his capital at Samarkand, rather than simply killing them. After his death in 1405 CE, his son Shahrukh moved the Timurid capital to Herat in eastern Khorasan and inaugurated one of the most refined cultural periods in Persian history. The court at Herat became a magnet for poets, painters, calligraphers and philosophers. Shahrukh's son, the astronomer Prince Ulugh Beg, built an observatory at Samarkand and calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of modern precision, using 15th century instruments and pure observational genius. It was painting, however, that achieved perhaps the highest expression. The Herat school of miniature painting, working under the master Kamal al-Din Behzad, produced works of extraordinary delicacy. Every tiny figure alive with personality, every garden and palace rendered in jewel-like detail. Persian poetry found new champions, and the libraries of Timurid princes became legendary. Brilliance and violence had braided themselves together across 2 centuries into something distinctly, unmistakably Persian. The next transformation would emerge from a different kind of fire entirely. Out of the ashes of Timurid splendour, something wholly unexpected rose. Not a foreign conqueror arriving from the steppes, not a dynasty carried in on horseback from Central Asia, but a movement born from within Iran itself, from the mystical Sufi brotherhoods that had quietly sustained Persian spiritual life for centuries. The Safavid order had its origins in the city of Ardabil in northwestern Iran, founded by a revered Sufi master named Safi al-Din in the early 14th century. For generations it remained a peaceful religious brotherhood, drawing followers through spiritual teaching rather than military ambition. Then gradually something hardened inside it. Political instability, the trauma of Timurid violence, and the ambitions of successive leaders transformed this contemplative order into something closer to a revolutionary army. Its followers, fanatically devoted, wore distinctive red headgear with 12 folds honouring the 12 imams of Shia tradition. History would call them the Kizilbash, the Redheads. In 1487 CE, a child named Ismail was born into this movement's leadership. He was precocious, magnetic, and possessed of an almost terrifying certainty about his divine purpose. By the time he was 12 years old, he was already leading his followers through hiding and exile, hunted by rival Turkmen powers. By the time he was 14, he was commanding armies. In 1501 CE, the 14-year-old Ismail captured Tabriz, the ancient city that had served as a Mongol capital, and declared himself Shah of Iran. The Safavid dynasty had begun, but the political declaration was almost secondary to the religious one that followed. Immediately Ismail proclaimed Twelver Shia Islam, the official state religion of Iran, and ordered his entire population to convert. This was not a gentle invitation. Sunni scholars who refused were executed. Shia rituals became compulsory. Cursing the first 3 Sunni caliphs was mandated from pulpits throughout the land. In a territory where the majority had been Sunni Muslim for centuries, this enforced transformation was carried out with the absolute conviction of a man who believed himself quite literally to be a divine figure. The consequences rippled outward immediately to Iran's west. The Ottoman Empire, the most powerful Sunni state on earth, recognized an existential rival. The collision came at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514 CE. Ottoman Sultan Selim I, commanding an army equipped with gunpowder, artillery, and disciplined infantry, crushed Ismail's cavalry-based forces. The Kizilbash warriors who believed their devotion made them invincible discovered that faith provided no protection against cannon fire. Ismail never recovered psychologically from the defeat. He withdrew, drank heavily, and never commanded another major campaign. But the state he had created proved more durable than the man himself. Calderan established an Ottoman Safavid frontier that would define the border between the Sunni and Shia worlds for centuries, a line whose echoes can still be traced in modern maps of the Middle East. What Ismail truly created more than any dynasty or border was a specifically Iranian religious identity. By making Twelver Shia Islam the defining characteristic of Iranian civilization, he separated Iran permanently from its Arab and Turkish Sunni neighbours and forged a sense of distinctiveness that would survive every subsequent conquest and upheaval. The Shia clergy, empowered and institutionalized, became permanent participants in Iranian political life. The full flowering of this new state, its arts, its administration, its architecture, and its extraordinary ambition would await a ruler of even greater genius. The foundations, however, had been permanently laid. When Shah Abbas I came to power in 1588 CE, he inherited a state under siege. Uzbek raiders pressed from the northeast, the Ottomans held vast territories to the west, and the Kizilbash tribal commanders who had once built Safavid power now threatened to devour it from within. What he did next would transform Iran into one of the most sophisticated empires on earth. His first instinct was ruthlessly practical. Recognizing that the tribal cavalry loyal to their own chiefs was more a liability than an asset, Abbas dismantled the old military structure and built something entirely new. Drawing on the model of the Ottoman janissaries, he created regiments of trained slave soldiers, young Georgian, Armenian, and Circassian men absorbed into royal service, loyal exclusively to the Shah rather than to any tribal master. Equipped with muskets and artillery, this modernized army gave Abbas the instrument he needed. The reconquests came swiftly. He first made a humiliating but calculated peace with the Ottomans, trading territory for time, then turned east to smash the Uzbek forces threatening Khorasan. By 1607 CE, he had reversed the Ottoman concessions entirely, recapturing Tabriz, Baghdad, and vast stretches of Mesopotamia, in a sequence of campaigns that announced Safavid Iran as a military power demanding serious respect. But Abbas was not merely a general, he was a builder of civilizations. In 1598 CE, he moved his capital to Isfahan, a city of roughly 500,000 inhabitants nestled on the central Iranian plateau, and proceeded to remake it into one of the most beautiful urban spaces the world had ever seen. Persian architects working under his patronage constructed the Naqsh Jahan Square, an immense public space more than 500 meters long, ringed by two-story arcades sheltering thousands of shops. At its southern end rose the Sheikh Lotfollah Mosque, its tiled dome shifting between cream and rose depending on the angle of light. Dominating the square's southern axis stood the Great Shah Mosque. Its entrance portal, soaring nearly 30 meters high, covered in turquoise and cobalt tile work of extraordinary intricacy. Persians simply called Isfahan, Nesfe Jahan, half the world. The boast was not entirely immodest. The bazaars connecting the square to the older city became arteries of global commerce. Safavid carpets, their geometric and floral patterns achieving a technical and artistic refinement never surpassed before or since, flowed outward to European courts and Ottoman palaces. Persian miniature painting, silk weaving, and metalwork reached peaks of accomplishment that left visiting European diplomats struggling for adequate descriptions. Those diplomats arrived in considerable numbers. Abbas actively courted European powers as strategic counterweights against the Ottomans, dispatching embassies to Spain, England, and the courts of Italy. The partnership produced concrete results. In 1622 CE, with English naval assistance from the East India Company, Abbas expelled the Portuguese from their fortified trading post at Hormuz, reasserting Iranian control over the critical entrance to the Persian Gulf and reshaping regional trade routes in Safavid favour. The century following Abbas would slowly erode what he had built. Weaker successors proved unable to maintain either military discipline or the extraordinary administrative energy he had sustained across a 42-year reign. By 1722 CE, Afghan invaders from the east would march nearly unopposed into Isfahan itself, ending Safavid rule. Yet the Isfahan Abbas created endured. Its mosques still stand. Its square still draws millions of visitors annually. What he built in stone and tile outlasted every conqueror who followed. Which brings us to the question of what rose from those ruins next. The Afghan tribesmen who poured through Isfahan's gates in 1722 came not as a sophisticated conquering civilization, but as opportunists seizing a rotting prize. The Ghilzai Afghans under Mahmud Hotaki had besieged the great city for months, starving its population into submission. The last Safavid Shah, Sultan Hussein, surrendered his crown in person. What followed was 7 years of brutal occupation that shattered the social fabric Abbas had so carefully constructed. Population estimates for Isfahan collapsed from perhaps 500,000 to barely 100,000 within a generation. Yet chaos in Iranian history has a habit of producing remarkable men. Nader Qoli, born somewhere around 1688 into a modest family in the northeastern province of Khorasan, understood power the way a craftsman understands his tools. Rising through tribal warfare and military service, he gradually positioned himself as the indispensable military force capable of driving the Afghans out. By 1729, he had done exactly that, shattering the Ghilzai forces and restoring a nominal Safavid to the throne. But everyone understood who truly held Iran in his fist. In 1736, Nader dropped the pretense entirely and crowned himself Shah. His ambitions, however, extended far beyond Iranian borders. The invasion of India stands as one of history's most spectacular military adventures. The Mughal Empire, once a colossus stretching across the subcontinent, had decayed almost as completely as the Safavids. In 1739, Nader crossed the Indus, crushed a vastly larger Mughal force at the Battle of Karnal, and entered Delhi. What he extracted from that city staggers the imagination. The peacock throne constructed for the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, at a cost equivalent to twice the price of the Taj Mahal, was carried back to Iran. So was the Koh-i-Noor diamond, a stone whose subsequent journey through Afghan, Sikh, and finally British hands would make it one of history's most contested objects. The loot from Delhi was so vast that Nader abolished taxation across Iran for 3 years. But brilliance and cruelty travelled together in Nader Shah. His later years darkened into paranoia and savage repression. In 1747, his own officers murdered him in his tent, and Iran fractured once more. The decades following produced competing warlords and dynasties fighting over the Iranian heartland. From this struggle emerged 2 principal contenders. Karim Khan Zand, ruling from Shiraz in the south, proved a genuinely unusual figure in this brutal era, a leader who preferred the modest title of Vakil, regent of the people, over imperial grandeur. His reign brought relative peace and modest prosperity to southern Iran, but his Zand dynasty would not survive him for long. Pressing from the north and east, a Turkish tribal confederation called the Qajars waited patiently for their moment. That moment was coming, and with it an entirely new chapter in Iran's ancient story. The man who united Iran under Qajar rule was not a figure history remembers fondly. Aga Muhammad Khan, the dynasty's ferocious founder, had been castrated as a boy by political enemies, and whatever cruelty the world had shown him, he returned with interest. By 1796 he had crushed the last Zand pretender and seized control of the Iranian plateau, choosing Tehran, then little more than a provincial town, as his new capital. He was assassinated the following year before he could consolidate his empire further, but the dynasty he built would endure for over a century. The Qajar Shahs who followed were a different breed from the warrior who founded their line. They were courtiers, comfortable with ceremony, fond of pleasure, and dangerously unprepared for the new world pressing in on Iran's borders. That world arrived in the form of 2 empires whose appetite seemed without limit. Russia was expanding southward with relentless momentum, absorbing the Caucasian kingdoms that had long existed within Iran's sphere of influence. 2 catastrophic wars settled the question permanently. The Treaty of Gulistan in 1813 stripped Iran of territories including modern Georgia and parts of Azerbaijan. The Treaty of Turkmenchay in 1828 cut even deeper, surrendering additional Caucasian lands and forcing Iran to pay a ruinous indemnity of 5 million silver rubles. Perhaps worse than the territory lost were the capitulation clauses, legal provisions granting Russian citizens special protections inside Iran that Iranian courts could not touch. sovereignty was becoming a polite fiction. Britain watched from the south with equal calculation. London's obsession was not Iran itself, but India, the crown jewel of British imperial ambition. Iran was a buffer, a corridor, a potential invasion route that had to be managed, pressured, and kept dependent. The two empires competed across Iranian soil in what historians would call the Great Game, a phrase that sanitizes with sporting language what was in practice a systematic dismemberment of Iranian independence. Into this grinding pressure stepped Nasir al-Din Shah, who ruled for nearly half a century beginning in 1848. He was not without curiosity or intelligence. He travelled to Europe 3 times, marvelling at railways and telegraphs, and attempted to introduce some of these wonders to Iran. A telegraph line connected Tehran to the wider world. Military academies opened. A newspaper began publication. Yet modernization without structural reform was decoration on a rotting wall. To fund his court and his ambitions, Nasir al-Din Shah sold Iran piece by piece. Concessions granted to British and Russian interests handed control of banking, roads, fisheries, and extraction rights to foreign companies. The most catastrophic of these was the tobacco concession of 1,890, which gave a British firm monopoly control over the entire production and sale of Iranian tobacco. The Iranian response was extraordinary. In 1891, one of the country's senior religious scholars issued a ruling declaring tobacco use forbidden so long as foreign control persisted. In a society where tobacco was woven into daily life, the effect was immediate and electric. Iranians put down their pipes across the country. Even the women of the royal harem reportedly refused to smoke. The Shah had no choice but to cancel the concession, though the financial penalties cost Iran dearly. It was the first mass political movement in modern Iranian history, a preview of something larger gathering beneath the surface. Nasir al-Din Shah never grasped what the tobacco protest truly signalled. In 1896, on the eve of celebrations marking 50 years of his reign, he was shot dead by an assassin. The old order was cracking, and the Iranian people were beginning to imagine something their rulers had never offered them a voice in their own fate. The voice the Iranian people imagined did not remain silent for long. By 1905, a coalition of merchants, intellectuals, and religious scholars had found common cause in their fury at Qajar misrule and foreign domination. Street protests, strikes, and the traditional practice of Bast taking sanctuary in a sacred space to demand justice paralysed Tehran. The movement was remarkable in its breadth. Clerics who had never sat beside secular reformers found themselves united by a single demand: a constitution, a parliament, a law that bound even the Shah himself. Mozaffar al-Din Shah, weakened and ailing, conceded. In 1906, Iran became one of the first countries in Asia to establish a constitutional monarchy. A parliament called the Majles convened in Tehran, and for a brief, extraordinary moment, ordinary Iranians held genuine political power. The moment did not last. The new Shah Muhammad Ali despised the constitution and in 1908 used Russian-trained Cossack troops to bombard the parliament building into rubble. A civil war followed. Constitutionalists fought back from Tabriz and elsewhere, eventually restoring the constitution in 1909. Yet the victory was hollow. In 1907, Britain and Russia had quietly signed the Anglo-Russian Convention, formally dividing Iran into spheres of influence: a Russian zone in the north, a British zone in the south, and a nominally neutral belt between them. Iran was not consulted. The First World War completed Iran's humiliation. Though Tehran declared neutrality, the country became a battleground for Russian, British, and Ottoman forces. Famine swept through large parts of the country. Perhaps 2 million Iranians died from starvation and disease, a catastrophe largely forgotten by the outside world. Out of this devastation came a soldier named Reza Khan. In February 1921, commanding the Cossack Brigade, he marched on Tehran and seized power in a swift coup. He was practical, ruthless, and possessed of an iron will to restore Iranian sovereignty and order. Within 4 years, he had outmaneuvered every rival. In 1925, the last Qajar Shah was formally deposed, and Reza Khan crowned himself, founding the Pahlavi dynasty. As Reza Shah, he pursued modernization with the force of a military campaign. A trans-Iranian railway stretching nearly 900 miles was completed by 1938. Secular courts replaced religious ones. Universities opened. The veil was forcibly banned for women in 1936, a reform imposed without consent as officers tore headscarves from women in the streets. He also broke Iran's economic dependence piece by piece, renegotiating the British oil concession and building a modern state bureaucracy. But Reza's authoritarianism made him vulnerable. When the Second World War engulfed the region, and Britain and the Soviet Union grew suspicious of his overtures to Germany, they simply invaded Iran in August 1941 and forced him to abdicate. His son Mohammad Reza would inherit a throne already trembling beneath him. The young Shah, who inherited that trembling throne in 1941, was just 21 years old, slight and uncertain, surrounded by a country that had been occupied, humiliated, and was now seething with political energy long suppressed by his father. Into that opening stepped Mohammad Mossadegh, a French-educated lawyer from an aristocratic family. Mossadegh had spent decades in opposition, insisting that Iranian sovereignty meant nothing as long as British Petroleum, operating under the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, extracted the country's greatest resource while returning only a fraction of its value to Iranians. The numbers were stark. Britain collected more in taxes from the company than Iran received in royalties. The oil beneath Persian soil was financing British power while Iranians lived in poverty. In April 1951, the Majlis voted to nationalize the oil industry. Mossadegh became prime minister. Crowds filled the streets of Tehran in celebration. For the first time in living memory, Iran would control its own wealth. The British response was swift and merciless. A naval blockade stopped Iranian oil from reaching world markets. Diplomats and technicians withdrew. The economy began to suffocate. Washington watched uneasily. The Truman administration had initial sympathy for Mossadegh's democratic credentials. The Eisenhower administration that followed did not. By 1953, the Cold War calculus had hardened. A weakened, unstable Iran on the Soviet border was in American eyes a communist invitation. The CIA and British intelligence services conceived Operation Ajax. In August 1953, paid mobs stormed through Tehran. Military officers loyal to the Shah moved against Mossadegh's government. Within days, it was over. Mossadegh was arrested, tried, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The Shah returned from brief exile, now indebted to foreign powers in ways that would define and ultimately destroy his reign. What followed were decades of paradox. The Shah pursued genuine modernization through his White Revolution beginning in 1963, redistributing land, expanding education, granting women the right to vote. Industrialization transformed Iranian cities. Oil revenues, especially after the price shocks of the 1970s, poured money into infrastructure and a swelling middle class. Yet alongside every school built, every new highway paved, the secret police known as SAVAK tightened its grip. Tens of thousands were imprisoned. Torture was systematic. Political parties were abolished. Iran grew richer and more repressive simultaneously, a combination that breeds not gratitude but fury. And the fury found a voice. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had been exiled in 1964 for denouncing the Shah's reforms as surrenders to foreign influence from Iraq and then from a suburb of Paris. He sent cassette tapes into Iran, his sermons duplicated by the thousands and passed hand to hand through mosques and bazaars. The medium was ancient. The message was electric. By late 1978, millions were in the streets. The Shah's army, vast and American-equipped, hesitated to massacre the crowds it faced. The institutions of modernization he had built, the universities, The urban professional classes had produced people with expectations his government could not satisfy and patience it had exhausted. On February the 1st, 1979, Khomeini's Air France flight landed at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran. The crowd that met him numbered in the millions. Within days, the monarchy that Cyrus the Great had first defined 25 centuries earlier was finished. Iran would now become something the ancient world could never have imagined. An Islamic republic, a theocracy born from revolution, shaped by grievance, and destined to reshape the Middle East and the modern world for generations to come. 25 centuries of empire, invasion, and reinvention reveal a civilization that has never stopped defying extinction. The Persian language survived every conqueror. The poetry of Rumi and Hafez, written under foreign occupation, became the literary inheritance of the entire Islamic world. A civilization that should have been absorbed and forgotten instead absorbed its conquerors, turning their religions, their languages, and their cultures into something distinctly, defiantly Iranian. How does a civilization do that? How does it bend without breaking again and again across more than 24 centuries? The answer lies not in any single king or battle, but in the quiet, persistent work of memory, adaptation, and cultural depth that has carried Iran forward through every storm. The Islamic Republic that emerged from the 1979 revolution faced immediate and severe challenges that tested its survival in ways few could have predicted. The hostage crisis at the American embassy in Tehran, beginning in November 1979 and lasting 444 days, turned Iran into an international pariah almost overnight. The United States severed diplomatic relations, froze Iranian assets abroad, and imposed economic sanctions that would remain in place for decades. The crisis radicalized Iranian politics further, sidelining moderate voices and strengthening hardline factions who viewed the United States as the Great Satan. Inside the country, the new government moved quickly to consolidate power. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was established as a parallel military force loyal directly to the supreme leader. Revolutionary tribunals sentenced thousands to death or long prison terms. Political parties that had supported the revolution but did not fully align with Khomeini's vision were suppressed. The press was brought under strict control. Universities were closed for 2 years during the so-called Cultural Revolution to purge Western influences and reorient education toward Islamic values. Yet even amid this intense consolidation, familiar patterns of Iranian resilience appeared. The Persian language remained the medium of instruction, administration, and daily life. Poets continued to write, often using classical forms to express contemporary pain and hope in ways that evaded direct censorship. Nowruz celebrations persisted as a national holiday that crossed ideological lines. Families gathered, set the Hafsin table with its symbolic items, and exchanged gifts, a quiet continuity that no political upheaval could erase. The 8-year war with Iraq became the defining experience of the early republic. Saddam Hussein's invasion in September 1980 aimed to seize the oil-rich province of Khuzestan and exploit Iran's post-revolutionary chaos. Iranian forces, many of them barely trained volunteers organized into the Basij militia, met the Iraqi army with fierce determination. The war turned into a grinding stalemate of trench warfare, artillery duels and chemical attacks. Cities like Khorramshahr and Abadan were devastated. Tehran itself came under missile bombardment during the so-called War of the Cities. The human cost was staggering. Estimates place Iranian casualties between 200,000 and 600,000 dead, with many more wounded or disabled. The economic damage ran into hundreds of billions of dollars. International isolation meant Iran fought largely alone, relying on domestic production and smuggling for weapons and spare parts. Young men volunteered in waves, driven by a mixture of religious conviction, nationalism, and revolutionary fervour. The war produced martyrs whose stories became part of the national narrative, commemorated in murals, songs, and annual ceremonies. When the ceasefire finally came in August 1988, accepted by Khomeini, with the famous statement that it was more bitter than drinking poison, Iran had preserved its territorial integrity but at enormous cost. The conflict left deep social and psychological scars. A generation grew up knowing only war, sacrifice, and isolation. Yet the experience also strengthened a sense of national unity and defiance that would shape Iranian politics for decades. Khomeini's death in June 1989 marked another turning point. The Assembly of Experts chose Ali Khamenei as supreme leader. The presidency passed to Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who promised reconstruction and pragmatic economic policies. Rafsanjani's administration focused on rebuilding infrastructure damaged by war, attracting foreign investment where possible, and easing some social restrictions. The economy began to recover slowly, though sanctions and mismanagement limited progress. The 1990s brought tentative openings and new tensions. Mohammad Khatami's election as president in 1997 represented a moment of hope for many Iranians. His campaign emphasized dialogue among civilizations, rule of law, and greater civil liberties. For a brief period, press freedom expanded, student movements gained voice, and cultural life showed signs of loosening. Films, books, and music that had been suppressed began to appear. Yet these reforms faced fierce resistance from conservative institutions, the Guardian Council, the judiciary, and elements within the Revolutionary Guards. Many of Khatami's initiatives were blocked or reversed. The early 2000s saw continued struggle between reformist impulses and hardline control. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presidency from 2005 to 2013 brought a return to populist rhetoric, nuclear defiance, and intensified confrontation with the West. Iran's nuclear program became the central international issue. Sanctions tightened dramatically, crippling the economy and fueling domestic discontent. The 2009 presidential election sparked the largest protests since the revolution. When Ahmadinejad was declared the winner, amid widespread allegations of fraud, millions took to the streets in what became known as the Green Movement. Security forces cracked down harshly. Dozens were killed, thousands arrested. The movement was suppressed, but the images of protest and repression entered the global consciousness and left lasting divisions within Iranian society. Through all these upheavals, war, sanctions, internal power struggles, mass protests, the deeper currents of Iranian civilization continued their quiet work. Persian poetry remained a refuge and a form of resistance. Classical poets were quoted in private conversations and public speeches alike. Nowruz endured as a unifying national celebration. Family networks, bazaar merchants, and local religious traditions provided social glue when state institutions faltered. Iran entered the 21st century as a nation shaped by its revolutionary ideology, yet still carrying the weight of 25 centuries of history. The plateau, the mountains, the ancient cities, and the Persian language continued their patient labor of preservation and adaptation. The civilization that had absorbed Alexander, the Arabs, the Turks, and the Mongols showed every sign of absorbing its own revolution, and its consequences as well. The Islamic Republic entered the 21st century, carrying both the weight of its revolutionary origins and the persistent patterns of Iranian history. The nuclear program, which had begun under the Shah as a civilian energy project, became the defining international issue. Iran insisted its intentions were peaceful. Western governments suspected weapons ambitions. Successive rounds of UN sanctions, American unilateral measures, and European restrictions squeezed the economy. Oil exports dropped sharply, inflation rose, currency value fell. Ordinary Iranians felt the pressure in daily life. Higher prices for imported goods, shortages of medicine, and growing difficulty obtaining foreign currency for travel or education abroad. Yet the same adaptability that had marked earlier centuries appeared once more. Private entrepreneurship filled gaps left by state controls. Small businesses, family workshops, and informal trade networks kept goods moving. The bizarre tradition, long a backbone of Iranian commerce, proved resilient in the face of modern sanctions. Young Iranians turned to technology and digital platforms, building startups, creating content, and connecting with the wider world despite official restrictions on many sites. Cultural life continued its quiet defiance. Persian cinema produced internationally acclaimed films that explored social themes with subtlety and depth. Directors like Asghar Farhadi won Oscars while telling stories of moral complexity set in contemporary Iran. Music, especially underground rock, hip-hop, and fusion styles, flourished despite censorship, spreading through private gatherings and file sharing. Literature remained vibrant. Poets and novelists found ways to address current realities using metaphor, allegory, and historical allusion techniques refined over centuries of navigating power. Nowruz stayed the most widely observed holiday. Families across the country, regardless of political views or religious observance, prepared the Hafsin table, visited relatives, and exchanged greetings. The 13-day celebration ended with Sizdah Bedar, the outdoor picnic where people tied grass knots to symbolize casting away troubles, a ritual unchanged since pre-Islamic times. Political life showed cycles of opening and closing. The 2013 election of Hassan Rouhani as president brought a measure of moderation. His administration negotiated the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, with world powers. Sanctions were eased in stages, oil exports recovered, foreign investment began to return. For a brief period, ordinary Iranians felt a slight loosening of economic pressure. The relief proved short-lived. In 2018, the United States withdrew from the JCPOA under President Trump and reimposed maximum pressure sanctions. The Iranian economy contracted sharply. Protests erupted in late 2017 and again in 2019 over fuel prices and living costs. Security forces responded with force. Hundreds died. The internet was shut down for days, one of the longest national blackouts ever recorded. The November 2019 protests marked a shift. Unlike earlier movements focused on election fraud or political reform, these were raw expressions of economic despair and anger at the entire system. Slogans targeted not just particular leaders but the revolutionary order itself. The government's response, live ammunition, mass arrests, and severe internet restrictions deepened the divide between state and society. The early 2020s brought further strain. The COVID-19 pandemic hit Iran hard. Official figures reported hundreds of thousands of cases and tens of thousands of deaths, though many believed the true toll was higher. Sanctions limited access to medical supplies and vaccines. Economic hardship worsened. Public trust in institutions eroded further. In September 2022, the death of Mahsa Amini in morality police custody after her arrest for improper hijab sparked nationwide protests. Women led the way, cutting their hair and burning headscarves in public. The slogan, "Woman, Life, Freedom," became a rallying cry that crossed ethnic, regional, and class lines. Demonstrations spread to universities, bazaars, and small towns. Security forces killed hundreds. Thousands were arrested. The internet was throttled again. Yet the protests continued for months, the most sustained challenge to the Islamic Republic since 1979. Through all these crises, sanctions, pandemic, mass protests, the deeper continuities held, Persian remained the unifying language. Poetry circulated in private messages and on social media. Families gathered for Nowruz. Historical sites drew visitors. The land itself, the plateau, the Zagros, the deserts, the Caspian shore stayed constant, shaping lives as it had for millennia. Iran entered the mid-2020s as a nation of contradictions. Revolutionary ideology and ancient traditions, international isolation and global cultural influence, economic hardship and private resilience, state control and individual expression. The civilization that had bent under Cyrus, Alexander, the Arabs, the Mongols, the Safavids, the Qajars, and the Pahlavis was bending once more under its own revolution and its aftermath. The pattern that has repeated across 25 centuries did not stop with the revolution of 1979 or the protests of recent decades. It simply took new forms suited to a different age. The Iranian people continued the same quiet work their ancestors had done under Greek kings, Arab caliphs, Turkish sultans, and Mongol khans. They absorbed what was useful from the outside world, preserved what was essential from their own past, and gradually shaped both into something recognizably their own. One of the clearest examples of this process today is the Iranian diaspora. More than 5 million Iranians live outside the country, in cities from Los Angeles to Toronto, London to Sydney. They left for many reasons: political upheaval, economic pressure, educational opportunity, but they did not leave their culture behind. In their new homes, they established Persian language schools, community centres, and cultural associations. Children born abroad learned the same poems their grandparents had memorised in Tehran or Shiraz. Families gathered each March for Nowruz, setting the Haft-Sin table with its 7 symbols of renewal, exactly as it has been done for more than 2,000 years. Restaurants serving Persian food became small embassies of taste and memory. Musicians blended traditional instruments with modern genres and shared their work online, reaching audiences that had never set foot on the Iranian plateau. This diaspora did more than preserve the past. It extended Iranian influence in ways no army or king had ever achieved. Iranian films won awards at international festivals. Iranian writers published novels in multiple languages. Iranian scientists and engineers contributed to research institutions around the world. The same civilization that once sent its administrators to run the courts of Baghdad and Samarkand now sent its doctors, professors, and entrepreneurs to universities and companies on every continent. The language that had survived the destruction of Merv and Nishapur now appeared on university reading lists and in software code written by Iranian programmers in Silicon Valley. Inside Iran, the same adaptive spirit showed itself in practical responses to new challenges. Changing rainfall patterns and rising temperatures placed new demands on agriculture and water management. Farmers and engineers turned again to the ancient Qanat systems, repairing old channels and digging new ones with modern tools. Villages in the Zagros and the Central Plateau revived techniques their ancestors had used to survive on this difficult land. Researchers at universities studied drought-resistant crops and shared their findings with rural communities. The plateau that had once forced the Medes and Persians to learn cooperation with nature was teaching the same lesson to a new generation. Young Iranians found their own ways to connect past and present. In cities, they formed private reading groups where they discussed classical poetry alongside contemporary novels. University students studied engineering and medicine, while quoting Hafez in their conversations. Musicians performed in private homes, mixing the melodies of traditional Persian music with jazz or electronic sounds. The game of chess, refined at the Sasanian court more than 1400 years ago, remained popular in parks and coffee houses. Polo, once a royal training exercise, continued in some regions as both sport and living link to earlier centuries. Environmental awareness grew steadily. School programs taught children the history of the Khanats and the importance of protecting mountain watersheds. Volunteer groups planted trees in areas damaged by earlier overgrazing and urban expansion. Scientists published studies on climate patterns and worked with local communities to find practical solutions. The same land that had shaped the first fire temples and the first great empires was now shaping conversations about sustainability in the modern world. The Persian language itself continued its long career of adaptation. New words entered for technology, science, and global culture, yet the core grammar and poetic tradition remained intact. Writers used the same subtle, layered style that had allowed poets to speak safely under previous rulers. Readers recognized the old techniques and appreciated how they served new purposes. The language that had once absorbed Arabic vocabulary during the Abbasid period now absorbed English technical terms while keeping its distinctive rhythm and beauty. Family life provided another steady anchor. Despite changes in law and social expectations, the extended family remained the most important social unit. Generations lived close to one another, sharing meals, stories, and responsibilities. Weddings and funerals followed traditional patterns even when they included modern elements. Parents taught their children the same values of hospitality and respect for elders that appear in the Shahnameh and the writings of Sa'di. These private continuities proved more durable than many public institutions. Iran's place in the wider region also reflected the same pattern of influence through culture rather than force. The Persian language served as a bridge in Central Asia and the Caucasus, spoken in communities that had maintained contact for centuries. Iranian films and television programs reached audiences in neighboring countries. Scholars and artists from Iran participated in international conferences and exhibitions. The civilization that had once sent its administrators to govern distant provinces now sent its ideas and creative works across borders. As the 21st century continued, the Iranian people faced the same basic task their ancestors had faced many times before: how to live with dignity on a difficult land while meeting the demands of a changing world. The answers they found drew on the same qualities that had sustained them through earlier centuries: practical ingenuity, respect for learning, deep attachment to family and language, and a quiet determination to preserve identity while accepting necessary change. The plateau remained the constant frame of the story. Its mountains still rose against the sky. Its rivers still followed the same ancient courses. Its deserts still demanded careful stewardship. The land that had produced the first permanent settlements near Susa and the first great empires under Cyrus and Darius continued to shape the lives of those who lived upon it. The civilization that had absorbed so many outsiders and turned them into something Iranian was still at work in the present day, quietly and persistently, in homes and villages, in classrooms and workshops, in poems and family gatherings. The long arc that began with the early settlers on the Iranian plateau had not reached its end. It had simply entered another chapter in a story that had already lasted more than 25 centuries and showed every sign of continuing for many more. Section 18. The story of Iran is not finished. It never has been. From the first permanent settlements near Susa to the cities and villages of the present day, the same essential qualities have carried the civilization forward. A deep attachment to the land, an unbroken thread of language and memory, a practical genius for adaptation, and an ability to absorb what arrives from outside while keeping what is most fundamentally its own. The Iranian plateau remains the unchanging stage. Its mountains still catch the winter snow that feeds rivers in spring. Its deserts still demand careful use of every drop of water. Its river valleys still support the same patterns of settlement that began thousands of years ago. The geography that shaped the Elamites, the Medes, the Persians, and every people who came after them continues to shape lives today. Farmers in the provinces repair qanats with the same careful attention their ancestors gave them. Engineers design modern water systems that respect the logic of the old ones. The land has always required ingenuity, and ingenuity has always been the answer. The Persian language endures as the strongest single thread in the long story. It has changed over time, taking in words from Arabic, Turkish, Mongol, and now English and French. Yet it remains recognizably the same language Ferdowsi used to write the Shahnameh, the same language Hafez used for his ghazals, the same language spoken in homes from Tehran to Tabriz to Mashhad today. Children learn classical poetry in school. Adults quote it in conversation. Writers use its rhythms to speak about the present while drawing on centuries of shared literary memory. The language has outlasted every dynasty, every conqueror, every revolution. It is the quiet proof that something essential has never been lost. Cultural traditions continue their steady rhythm. Nowruz arrives each spring, as it has for more than 2,500 years. Families prepare the Haft-Sin table with its 7 symbols. They visit relatives, exchange gifts, and spend the 13 days of celebration together. Sizda Bedar brings people outdoors to tie knots in grass and cast away troubles, an ancient custom that survives unchanged. These observances cross every political boundary and every social difference. They remind people of continuity in a world that changes quickly. Family remains the most important structure in Iranian life. Generations live close to one another or stay in frequent contact. Meals are shared, stories are told, responsibilities are divided. The extended family provides support when public institutions are distant or unreliable. Weddings follow patterns that mix old customs with new elements. Funerals bring communities together in shared mourning. These private continuities have proven more durable than many public systems. Young Iranians today grow up with both their heritage and the wider world at their fingertips. They study classical literature while using global technology. They listen to traditional music alongside international genres. They play chess in parks and polo in some regions, keeping living links to the past. University students, more than half of them women, pursue fields that range from medicine to artificial intelligence. Their education draws on the same tradition of learning that once made Gondishapur a centre of knowledge and now makes Iranian universities respected contributors to global research. The diaspora extends the story outward. Millions of Iranians live abroad, yet they remain connected. They teach their children the language. They celebrate Nowruz. They support family members at home. They produce films, music, books, and scientific work that carry Iranian perspectives into the world. The civilization that once absorbed foreign rulers now sends its people and ideas peacefully across borders, influencing cultures far beyond the plateau. Iran's place in the region reflects the same pattern of cultural rather than purely military influence. The Persian language is spoken in parts of Central Asia and the Caucasus. Iranian films and television programs reach audiences in neighbouring countries. Scholars and artists participate in international exchanges. The same soft power that once made Persian the administrative and literary language of much of the Islamic world continues in modern forms. The central mystery that began this journey, how a civilization can be conquered again and again, yet never truly disappear, finds its answer in these small, persistent facts. The land shapes practical responses to scarcity and change. The language carries memory across generations. Family and tradition provide stability amid upheaval. Cultural production adapts old forms to new realities. The people who live on the Iranian plateau have learned, over more than 25 centuries, how to bend without breaking. Every great civilization eventually disappears. Its language dies. Its religion is forgotten. Its cities are buried under centuries of sand and silence. That is the rule of history, and it is nearly universal. Iran broke the rule. Over the last 2,500 years, the land and people we now call Iran have been conquered by Greeks, Arabs, Turks, and Mongols. They have seen their capitals burned, their libraries destroyed, and their ruling dynasties erased entirely, some of them more than once. And yet the Persian language survived every invasion. The poetry of Rumi and Hafez, written under foreign occupation, became the literary inheritance of the entire Islamic world. A civilization that should have been absorbed and forgotten, instead absorbed its conquerors, turning their religions, their languages, and their cultures into something distinctly, defiantly Iranian. That is the quiet miracle at the heart of this long story. It is not the work of any single king or battle or revolution. It is the work of ordinary people who kept speaking the same language, celebrating the same spring festival, telling the same stories, and living on the same difficult, beautiful land. The journey we began tonight has taken us from the earliest settlements to the present day. It has shown how one civilization, pressed between mountains and deserts at the crossroads of continents, has endured by remembering who it is while learning what it must become. Now, as the night deepens and the world outside grows quiet, let the story settle gently. The plateau is still there, the language is still spoken, the families are still gathering. The same resilient spirit that carried Iran through every past storm is carrying it forward still. Rest easy knowing that some things outlast empires, outlast revolutions, outlast time itself.